Gaza, once home to over 2 million people, now an open-air graveyard of dreams. In the wake of relentless bombardment, nearly 90% of its people are displaced, stripped of safety, shelter, and any certainty about tomorrow. And now, a new proposal has emerged, denied and finally approved. Not from Gaza's neighbors, not from its Arab kin, but from thousands of miles away, in a land just as scarred by war, South Sudan. What first emerged as a diplomatic leak, with Israel approaching East Africa's war-ravaged country with a controversial request to resettle Palestinians from Gaza, has now become a reality, with the Parliament of South Sudan approving a proposal to resettle Palestinians forcefully expelled from their land by Israel in what Prime Minister Netanyahu calls voluntary relocation. While South Sudan had earlier denied reports that it was in talks with Israel to resettle Palestinians to the troubled East African country, the government in Juba has now been forced to eat its own vomit after publicly admitting the legislative had approved a proposal to resettle the Palestinian. This revelation, first reported by The Telegraph, has sparked fierce debate, with critics accusing Israel of attempting a form of ethnic cleansing, while supporters argue it provides a humanitarian escape for civilians trapped in a war zone. The phrase, "from fire to hell," captures the tragic irony of this proposal. Moving people from one devastated landscape to another, from the bombed-out ruins of Gaza to the famine-stricken, conflict-ridden expanse of South Sudan. This isn't merely a story about refugee resettlement. It's a revealing examination of how powerful nations manipulate vulnerable populations and struggling states in pursuit of strategic objectives. But why South Sudan? What are the geopolitical and economic motivations behind this deal? And could this set a dangerous precedent for forced displacement in conflict zones? And most importantly for Africans and South Sudanese, while the political elite will bag money, what will be the implication of this relocation to the local population? Will we see Palestinians demand a state in South Sudan and fight for it with tooth and nail the same way Israel is fighting for the Gaza Strip? We will break it down. The mechanics of this potential deal, as revealed through diplomatic sources, paint a picture of transactional diplomacy at its most stark. According to reports, the arrangement involves a complex web of incentives and beneficiaries that extends far beyond the two primary parties. The United Arab Emirates would provide crucial funding to South Sudan, a financial lifeline for what remains one of the world's poorest nations. The United States would lift existing sanctions on South Sudan, while Israel would invest in health and education infrastructure. A South Sudanese foreign ministry official, speaking to The Telegraph, framed the arrangement in pragmatic terms. The South Sudanese land is enough to host more people from different nations, and also it's good for the South Sudanese to open wide the window for external business to grow the economy. Yet the same official acknowledged the controversial nature of the deal, noting that while the cabinet had reportedly agreed, there was stiff opposition elsewhere, making the government unwilling to acknowledge it. This reluctance speaks to the fundamental tension inherent in the proposal. South Sudan has denied holding discussions with Israel about the potential resettlement of Palestinians from Gaza in the East African country. The immediate denial following media reports suggests the sensitivity surrounding any formal acknowledgement of such discussions. To understand this proposal, one must examine it within the broader context of Israeli policy under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The idea of Palestinian voluntary resettlement from Gaza didn't originate in isolation. It represents the revival of a concept that has been floating in Israeli political circles and found renewed momentum under the Trump administration. President Trump first floated the idea of relocating Gaza's population in February 2025, envisioning the territory's complete redevelopment as part of a Riviera in the Middle East. Netanyahu has consistently framed such relocations as voluntary, stating, "Give them the opportunity to leave, first of all, combat zones, and generally to leave the territory if they want. We will allow this, first of all, within Gaza during the fighting, and we will certainly allow them to leave Gaza as well." However, the context in which this choice is presented raises serious questions about the nature of voluntary action. Many Palestinians might want to leave Gaza, at least temporarily, to escape the war and a hunger crisis bordering on famine. But they have roundly rejected any permanent resettlement from what they see as an integral part of their national homeland. The fear among Palestinians is clear, that any mass departure would be permanent, enabling Israel to annex Gaza and re-establish Jewish settlements there, as advocated by far-right ministers in the Israeli government. To comprehend why South Sudan might consider such an arrangement, one must understand the nation's trajectory from hope to despair. Born in 2011 as the world's newest country after decades of struggle for independence from Sudan, South Sudan was supposed to represent Africa's self-determination and the promise of oil wealth shared equitably among its people. Instead, South Sudan has become a textbook case of how natural resources can become a curse rather than a blessing. 4 reasons why South Sudan ranks 5th on the International Rescue Committee's 2025 emergency watch list. The country has been ravaged by civil war, ethnic conflict, and economic collapse. Its infrastructure is virtually non-existent. Its institutions are weak, and its people face regular threats of famine and violence. The economic desperation driving South Sudan's consideration of this deal cannot be overstated. For a government struggling to provide basic services to its own population, the promise of UAE funding and lifted US sanctions represents a potential economic lifeline. However, this desperation also makes South Sudan particularly vulnerable to arrangements that may not serve its long-term interests or those of potential Palestinian refugees. The involvement of multiple regional players in this proposed deal reflects the complex geopolitical currents of the Middle East and Africa. The UAE's willingness to provide funding aligns with its broader regional strategy of maintaining influence across multiple theaters while balancing relationships with various stakeholders. For the UAE, funding such a resettlement could serve multiple purposes, demonstrating humanitarian concern, strengthening ties with Israel, and establishing influence in South Sudan. Egypt's reported opposition to the plan reveals another layer of regional complexity. Neighboring Egypt strongly opposes relocating Palestinians out of Gaza, fearing a surge of refugees across its border. Egypt has consistently rejected any resettlement scheme, despite significant pressure from the Trump administration. This opposition stems from both practical concerns about refugee influx and principled objections to what many see as forced displacement. The regional dynamic is further complicated by historical tensions between South Sudan and its northern neighbor, Sudan. The long war for independence pitted the mostly Christian and animist South against the predominantly Arab and Muslim North. Palestinians in particular could find themselves unwelcome. The long war for independence from Sudan pitted the mostly Christian and animist South against the predominantly Arab and Muslim North. This historical context suggests that Palestinian refugees, who would be perceived as Arab and Muslim, could face hostility in South Sudan. At the heart of this controversy lies a fundamental question about human dignity and agency. The proposal to move Palestinians from Gaza to South Sudan isn't merely about finding temporary shelter for displaced people. It represents a profound challenge to basic principles of human rights and international law. Human rights groups have warned that expelling the population from Gaza would violate international law. The forced displacement of civilian populations is considered a war crime under international humanitarian law. Even if framed as voluntary, the coercive circumstances under which such choices would be made raise serious questions about genuine consent. The Palestinians themselves have made their position clear. They view Gaza as an integral part of their national homeland and fear that any mass departure would become permanent. They fear that Israel will never allow them to return, and that a mass departure would allow it to annex Gaza and re-establish Jewish settlements there, as called for by far-right ministers in the Israeli government. The concept of voluntary resettlement becomes particularly problematic when examined against the backdrop of Gaza's current condition. After 22 months of intensive military operations, Gaza's infrastructure lies in ruins. Its economy has collapsed, and its population faces acute humanitarian crisis. In such circumstances, can any choice to leave truly be considered voluntary? The systematic destruction of residential buildings during Operation Gideon's Chariots and similar tactics expected in upcoming assaults on Gaza City create conditions where departure might seem like the only viable option for survival. This raises the specter of constructive forced displacement, creating conditions so intolerable that people have no real choice but to leave. Moreover, even those Palestinians who want to leave are unlikely to take their chances in South Sudan, among the world's most unstable and impoverished countries. The prospect of moving from one crisis to another hardly represents a genuine choice or improvement in circumstances. The internal debate within South Sudan reveals the controversial nature of this proposal, even among those who might benefit financially from it. One member of parliament told The Telegraph, "I myself reject it because South Sudan is a very young country. We are not able to feed ourselves. How can we get more people to live with us?" This practical objection cuts to the heart of the matter. How can a country facing its own humanitarian crisis reasonably be expected to absorb refugees from another conflict zone? The parliamentary opposition to the deal, despite potential economic benefits, suggests that many South Sudanese recognize the fundamental problems with the arrangement. The MPs comment that this idea is unacceptable to us, reflects not just practical concerns, but perhaps also ethical objections to being used as a dumping ground for displaced populations. South Sudan should not become a dumping ground for people, he said, and it should not accept to take people as negotiating chips to improve relations. This sentiment, expressed by civil society groups, captures the dignity issues at stake, both for Palestinians who would be displaced and for South Sudanese who would be expected to receive them. But this even puts forward one interesting question not only for South Sudan, but the African Union. This proposal must also be understood within the broader pattern of how Israel has dealt with Palestinian populations. Since 1948, various Israeli governments have consistently sought to reduce Palestinian demographic presence in territories under their control. The current proposal represents a continuation of this pattern, albeit through different means. The comparison to other displacement crises, Syria, Ukraine, and Afghanistan, as mentioned by Netanyahu, is telling but incomplete. In those cases, people fled primarily due to immediate threats to their safety, and the international community generally supported their right to return once conditions improved. The Gaza situation is different in that the proposed resettlement appears designed to be permanent, preventing return even after hostilities end. The economic dimensions of this deal reveal how desperate circumstances can lead to morally compromised positions. South Sudan's consideration of the proposal isn't driven by humanitarian concern for Palestinians, but by urgent need for economic assistance. This creates a troubling dynamic where human displacement becomes a commodity in international relations. The involvement of the UAE as a financial backer adds another layer of complexity. While the UAE's funding might provide South Sudan with much-needed resources, it also makes the Gulf state complicit in what critics view as forced displacement. For the UAE, which has worked to improve its international image and present itself as a regional stabilizer, association with such a controversial scheme carries reputational risks. The promise of lifted U.S. sanctions on South Sudan represents another form of economic inducement. These sanctions were imposed due to concerns about human rights abuses and governance failures. Lifting them in exchange for accepting Palestinian refugees essentially treats human rights sanctions as negotiable commodities rather than principled positions. If implemented, this resettlement scheme would set concerning precedents for how displacement crises are handled globally. It would essentially legitimize the practice of moving displaced populations not to neighboring countries or traditional refugee destinations, but to economically desperate nations that can be incentivized to accept them. The regional implications extend beyond the immediate parties involved. Other African nations would inevitably face pressure to accept similar arrangements, potentially turning the continent into a repository for displaced populations from conflicts elsewhere. This would further burden African countries already struggling with their own development challenges and internal displacement issues. For the Middle East, the precedent could encourage other countries to seek similar solutions to unwanted populations. The normalization of financially incentivized displacement could fundamentally alter how refugee crises are addressed, moving away from principles of protection and voluntary return toward market-based redistribution of human populations. Even if political agreements were reached, the practical challenges of implementing such a resettlement would be enormous. South Sudan lacks the infrastructure to handle large influxes of refugees. The country's health systems, educational facilities, and basic services are already overwhelmed by its own population's needs. The security implications are equally concerning. South Sudan continues to experience periodic violence between different ethnic groups and political factions. Introducing a new population group, particularly one that might be perceived as ethnically and religiously different, could exacerbate existing tensions and potentially trigger new conflicts. The logistics of moving potentially hundreds of thousands of people from Gaza to South Sudan would require massive international coordination and resources. The costs would extend far beyond the initial United Arab Emirates funding commitment, requiring sustained international support for years or decades. The long-term consequences of implementing such a scheme would likely be devastating for all parties involved. For Palestinians, it would represent the effective loss of part of their national homeland and the scattering of their population across distant continents. The trauma of such displacement would likely persist for generations. For South Sudan, accepting large numbers of refugees without adequate preparation could destabilize an already fragile state. The country's ethnic and religious tensions could be exacerbated, potentially triggering new conflicts or complicating existing ones. For Israel, while such a scheme might provide temporary demographic relief, it would likely damage the country's international standing and make long-term peace more difficult to achieve. The international community's opposition suggests that any short-term advantages would be outweighed by diplomatic costs. The proposed resettlement of Palestinians from Gaza to South Sudan represents more than a diplomatic initiative or humanitarian response. It embodies a fundamental choice about the kind of international system we wish to create and maintain. The scheme reveals how powerful nations manipulate vulnerable populations and desperate states in pursuit of strategic objectives, treating human displacement as a commodity to be traded rather than a tragedy to be resolved. But a fundamental understanding that accepting such arrangements would legitimize the forced displacement of populations as a tool of statecraft. Similarly, the opposition voices within South Sudan recognize that their country should not become a dumping ground for populations that other nations wish to remove. Ultimately, this controversy forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, dignity, and justice in international relations. Are we willing to accept a world where economic desperation can be exploited to facilitate what amounts to ethnic cleansing? Can we legitimize the displacement of populations by calling it voluntary, when the circumstances make genuine choice impossible? The international community's response to this proposal will reveal much about our collective commitment to human rights, international law, and the principles of justice that supposedly underpin the global order. The choice before us is stark. We can allow the normalization of financially incentivized displacement, or we can insist that human dignity rights remain non-negotiable regardless of economic or political pressures. The story of Gaza and South Sudan is ultimately a story about all of us, about the kind of world we are willing to accept and the principles we are prepared to defend. It is a test of whether the lessons learned from previous displacement crises have made us more committed to protecting vulnerable populations, or whether the realities of power politics will continue to override moral considerations. As we watch this controversy unfold, we must remember that behind every diplomatic initiative and every policy proposal are real human beings with lives, dreams, and rights that deserve protection. The true measure of any resettlement scheme should not be its convenience for powerful states or its economic benefits for desperate nations, but its impact on the dignity and well-being of the people it affects. The choice between fire and hell is no choice at all. The international community must demand better alternatives based on justice, human rights, and respect for the fundamental principle that no population should be forced from their homeland, regardless of the economic incentives offered or the diplomatic pressures applied. Only by holding firm to these principles can we hope to build a more just and humane international system that serves the needs of all people, not just the powerful. Please share this video to raise awareness about the situation in Gaza, and comment and like the video to make more people see this video. If you are new, remember to subscribe so you will be among the first to see our content when we upload. Until we meet again in the next video, be blessed.